The year 197 BC opened like a tightening fist. Across the Mediterranean world, two powers were rising toward each other with the slow, grinding inevitability of tectonic plates. On one side stood Rome, young, aggressive, still raw from the Punic Wars but armed with an iron sense of destiny. On the other stood Macedon, heir to Alexander's legacy, proud guardian of the Sarissa Phalanx, and the dominant force in Greece for more than a century. For generations, Macedonian kings had ruled by the length of their pikes. Their phalanxes formed walls of spear points so dense that no enemy could break through without being crushed under a forest of ashwood shafts. To the Hellenistic world, Macedon was the anvil on which history was hammered. But Rome had changed the balance. The Second Macedonian War had dragged into its fourth brutal year. What began as a distant conflict over influence in Greece had muttered its way into something far more dangerous, the direct test of military systems, political ambition and world views. To the Roman Senate, Macedon was not just another kingdom. It was a problem, a powerful monarch meddling too closely with the fragile web of Greek alliances Rome now relied on. And to Philip V of Macedon, Rome was an interloper, an outsider creeping eastward, threatening Macedonian prestige and Hellenistic autonomy. The man sent to resolve this collision was Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a commander barely 30 years old, sharp, disciplined, and unusually sympathetic to Greek culture. He arrived with a clear mandate: break Macedon's power, force Philip to heel, and settle the Greek world under Roman influence. By early spring, both armies were manoeuvring through Thessaly, pressing through mountains where low clouds clung to the ridges and visibility changed by the hour. Scouts vanished into fog that rolled across the hills like smoke. Every step carried both armies toward a cluster of broken, uneven heights the locals called the Dog's Heads, Cynoscephalae. Neither Rome nor Macedon planned to fight a decisive battle on those slopes, but the terrain was a trap waiting to be sprung. Once both armies stepped into it, the collision that had been building for years would finally strike with full force, and when it did, the ancient world would discover which engine of war, the Macedonian phalanx or the Roman legion, truly ruled the battlefield. The story moves now toward those fog-covered heights, where skirmishes felt their way into history's path. July 197 BC. Two armies, equal in size, unequal in purpose, faced off on the ridge of Cynoscephalae. This was not merely a clash of soldiers. It was a confrontation of ideologies, military systems, and the future of the Hellenistic world itself. Rome, fresh from the victory over Hannibal at Zama, was no longer just a power in the West. It was a force reshaping the Mediterranean order. Its legions were battle-tested, disciplined, and flexible, a system born of rugged terrain and hard-won experience. Across the field stood Macedon, led by Philip V, a kingdom built on centuries of conquest, wielding the fearsome phalanx that had crushed opponents for generations. Philip sought to expand, to seize the vacuum left in the east by Carthage's defeat. The stakes could not have been higher. Greece was a chessboard of alliances, cities and leagues, many of them already weary from Macedon's encroachment. Rhodes and Pergamum had called for Roman intervention, and the Senate answered. What was framed as liberation was more than diplomacy. It was the assertion of dominance, a preemptive strike against the rise of a power that could challenge Rome's new supremacy. Philip knew his phalanx was powerful, but only under perfect conditions: level terrain, cohesion, and the protection of his flanks. Any misstep could transform his army from an unstoppable wall into a vulnerable target. Flamininus, by contrast, commanded the legion's phalanx with joints, a system designed for chaos, hills, and the unpredictable fury of war. The armies manoeuvred across Thessaly, each seeking advantage. Philip moved cautiously, looking for ground to deploy his phalanx at full strength. Flamininus was content to fight almost anywhere, knowing the hills would favour flexibility over rigid power. And then, by chance or fate, the two armies would collide, not on a battlefield of Philip's choosing, but on terrain that would expose every weakness of the Macedonian system. Cynoscephalae mattered not just as a fight between men, but as a judgment on entire ways of war. It would determine whether Rome's adaptable, resilient legion could overcome the centuries-old supremacy of the Greek phalanx. It was a struggle with consequences far beyond the battlefield, shaping alliances, freedom, and the very map of Greece itself. The stage was set, and on these hills the doctrines of two empires would collide in a storm of violence, discipline, and fate. Before the first clash of steel, the true battle had already begun, not on the ridge, but in the design of the armies themselves. Cynoscephalae was a collision of philosophies, a contest between systems honed by centuries of war. On one side, the Macedonian phalanx, a dense, bristling wall of sarissas, perfected under Philip II and Alexander the Great, designed to crush anything in its path with irresistible frontal power. On the other, the Roman Manipular legion, smaller units, flexible lines, and trained initiative, a weapon built not to dominate but to adapt, survive, and exploit chaos. The phalangite carried the sarissa, an 18-foot pike that demanded both hands and a small shield slung from his neck. Alone, he was weak. Together, he was a living anvil, meant to fix the enemy in place while Macedon's cavalry delivered the hammer blow. But this power was conditional. Cohesion was everything. Level ground a necessity and flanks a vulnerability. A misstep, a gap, a broken ridge, and the phalanx became nothing more than an unwieldy trap. The Roman legion, by contrast, was a system of interlocking units. Maniples of 120 men moved like a single organism, yet could act independently. Each soldier wielded the pilum to disrupt enemy shields, the scutum to protect and shove, and the gladius to strike lethal blows in close quarters. The checkerboard formation, the triplex aces, allowed front lines to rotate, absorb fatigue, and exploit terrain that would destroy a phalanx. Flexibility was not a feature, it was the system itself. This was a battle between rigidity and adaptability, between a one-dimensional instrument of destruction and a versatile machine designed for uncertainty. The phalanx demanded perfection. The legion thrived on chaos. And as the armies approached the hills of Cynoscephalae, this fundamental truth would be tested under fire, sun, and fog. Here, doctrine mattered as much as courage. Equipment, terrain, and command were not details, they were destiny. And when these two engines of war finally met, the flaws of the Macedonian system and the strengths of the Roman maniples would become brutally clear. The stage was set, the fog would lift, and the first clash would echo a lesson that would redefine warfare for centuries. The hills of Cynoscephalae, known as the Dog's Heads, loomed ahead, jagged, uneven, and unpredictable. By dawn of July 197 BC, two armies were marching toward destiny, unaware that the terrain itself would decide their fate. Philip V, King of Macedon, moved cautiously. Every step of his phalanx demanded level ground and cohesion. Any broken ridge or hidden incline could turn his pride and power into chaos. He sought the perfect battlefield, a place where the immense weight of his sarissas could crush Roman defences. Flamininus, on the other hand, did not wait for perfection. His legions thrived in disorder, hills and valleys acting as allies rather than obstacles. He was content to fight almost anywhere, confident that flexibility would triumph over rigidity. The parallel march along Thessaly was a slow, tense dance. Scouts and light troops moved ahead, probing, skirmishing, and reporting back. Heavy fog hung over the ridges, concealing the enemy's movements and blurring the line between caution and recklessness. Both commanders knew that a single encounter could spark a battle. Neither had fully prepared to fight. At approximately 6:30 a.m., fate intervened. Advance parties of Roman and Macedonian infantry collided in the mist. A skirmish erupted, chaotic and fragmented, with neither side fully aware of the scope of the fight. Messengers rushed back to their main forces, urging reinforcements. Philip, hearing reports of a minor success, made a fateful choice. He committed his entire army to the ridge, abandoning the carefully calculated strategy that had governed his campaign. This single decision transformed the dogs' heads from a backdrop of manoeuvring into a crucible of battle. The rugged terrain, ill-suited to the Macedonian phalanx, now amplified the Romans' strength. Flamininus observed, calculated, and prepared to exploit the mistake. The maniples poised to strike where the rigid phalanx could not respond. The armies were on the ridge, the fog lifted, and the collision of two military worlds, one rigid, one adaptable, was about to begin in earnest. The ridge was quiet, yet every sound carried. Mist clung to the slopes like a living thing, concealing both friend and foe. At the forefront, scouts and light infantry probed cautiously, their movements the first whispers of what was about to explode into full-scale combat. Around 6:30 a.m., Roman and Macedonian patrols collided in the fog. What began as cautious reconnaissance instantly spiraled into chaotic skirmishes. Spears clashed, swords flashed, and both sides sent frantic messengers back to their commanders. Reports were fragmented, sometimes contradictory, feeding tension and uncertainty. Philip V, convinced by early reports of success on the ridge, made a critical choice. Ignoring the rugged terrain that had long constrained his phalanx, he ordered the main body of his army into the hills. The Macedonian formation, designed for open, level fields, now moved piecemeal, stretched thin across jagged slopes. Flamininus, observing from a distance, saw opportunity in the chaos. His legion, trained for adaptability and rapid response, began to maneuver into position. Manipular units adjusted to the contours of the ground, ready to strike gaps and flanks as soon as they appeared. Flexibility would meet rigidity on the ridges, and the battlefield itself would become a weapon. The skirmish had triggered more than combat. It had forced the Macedonian phalanx into terrain that nullified its strengths. The fog would lift, the sun would climb, and the clash of two military philosophies, the anvil of Macedon against the Manipular legion's joints, was about to erupt in full. The first volleys of the pilum, the thrusts of the gladius, and the bristling wall of sarissas were seconds away. And in those moments before battle, the fate of empires hung precariously, balanced on terrain, training, and a single commander's judgment. The fog thinned, revealing jagged ridges and uneven slopes that challenged every step of Philip's mighty phalanx. The Macedonian king, emboldened by early skirmish reports, pressed forward. His sarissas, long pikes that had crushed foes for over a century, now became both weapon and burden, the broken terrain threatening cohesion with every footfall. Philip's right wing formed first, advancing steadily. Dense, disciplined, and bristling with 16 ranks of sarissas, it seemed unstoppable. Soldiers moved as a single organism, the phalanx's power lying not in individual strength, but in the unity of the whole. Yet the hills had already begun to sap that unity. The left wing, commanded by Nicanor, struggled to crest the ridges in order. Columns faltered, gaps opened. The terrain that favoured flexibility would soon expose every weakness of the rigid formation. Flamininus did not commit recklessly. His legion's maniples adjusted to the contours of the ground, filling gaps and probing for weaknesses. War elephants led the Roman right wing, a terrifying shock force designed to exploit disarray. Every step of the Macedonian advance revealed vulnerabilities. The phalanx could not pivot, could not reform quickly, and could not respond to lateral threats. As Philip's men descended from the ridge, the clash was inevitable. The first volleys of javelins from the Roman hastati disrupted the rhythm of the sarissas. Roman light infantry slipped through gaps, harrying the flanks. The Macedonian formation pressed forward with brute force, yet the terrain and Roman adaptability began to tilt the balance. The stage was set for the decisive moment. Philip's pride, the centuries-old doctrine of the phalanx, faced the cunning, flexible Manipular legion. The hills of Cynoscephalae would witness the collision of two military philosophies, and the first shock of the phalanx's advance carried within it the seeds of catastrophic failure. The right wing pressed on, but the left faltered, and in that faltering the Romans saw their opening, a chance for manoeuvres that would shatter the Macedonian army and rewrite the rules of warfare. As Philip's phalanx pressed down the ridge, the Romans braced for impact. The fog had lifted, and the sun revealed the broken, uneven slopes, a nightmare for a formation built for flat plains. Flamininus saw what Philip could not: opportunity hidden in disorder. The Roman elephants, massive and terrifying, surged forward along the right wing, trumpeting and stomping, breaking the rhythm of the Macedonian advance. Behind them, the triplex aces, 3 lines of maniples in checkerboard formation, adapted to every rise and dip of the hills. The legionaries were not locked into a rigid wall. They flowed, folded and reformed as needed, responding instantly to every fluctuation in the enemy line. On the Roman left, the battle was more chaotic. Nicanor's left wing struggled to form, hindered by the terrain, leaving gaps. Flamininus exploited them ruthlessly. He detached maniples from the right wing, sending them across the ridge to flank the Macedonian left. The Phalanx, trained for forward pressure, could not pivot or protect itself from the sides. The sarissas that had once seemed unstoppable now became a liability. Every Roman thrust, every coordinated maneuver, amplified the Macedonian disorder. The elephants crushed morale as much as men, while maniples slipped through broken ranks, stabbing into gaps and sowing panic. Philip's forces had momentum on the right, but the left was unravelling, proof that cohesion was the phalanx's lifeblood. In these moments, the Roman legion demonstrated its greatest strength: adaptability under pressure. Flexibility and initiative, not sheer mass, dictated the flow of battle. Philip's phalanx, formidable in theory, was collapsing under conditions it could not master. And in that collapse, the seeds of a decisive Roman victory were already planted. On the slopes of Cynoscephalae, the Macedonian right wing had reached the crest first, its sarissas bristling in disciplined rows. Philip himself led the charge, every footstep down the hill driving the legionaries back. The phalangites moved as one, their 16-deep formation an iron tide of bristling pikes. Roman maniples on the right wing struggled to maintain cohesion under the relentless push. The clash was brutal. The massive reach of the sarissas kept the Romans at bay, their peeler barely scratching the formation. Roman shields met Macedonian spears in a grinding back and forth of pressure. Legionaries fell under the weight of disciplined pike thrusts, the sound of wood, iron and screams filling the high ground. Yet even as the Romans gave ground, Flamininus remained unshaken. He had built an army that could absorb pressure, reorganize and exploit even the smallest weakness. Behind the lines, maniples in checkerboard formation were already preparing to exploit the Macedonian momentum. The phalanx's single-minded forward assault would soon meet the legion's lateral adaptability. Philip's men pressed on, confident, but the left wing's disorder, Nicanor's failure to form a cohesive front, loomed like a shadow over the battlefield. The Romans, though pushed back on the right, were preparing for a maneuver that would strike at the phalanx's vulnerability, its inability to defend its flanks and rear. The Macedonian right wing advanced, unknowing that its apparent success was about to unravel. The seeds of collapse were planted in plain sight, and the Roman counterstrike, swift, flexible and lethal, was ready to spring. While Philip's right wing held its disciplined advance, the Macedonian left faltered. Nicanor's phalangites, strung out and disorganized by the broken terrain, struggled to form ranks. Hills and gullies tore through their tight formation, leaving gaps that the Roman maniples could exploit. Flamininus, ever the observant commander, seized the moment. The elephants on the Roman right surged forward, their bulk scattering the Macedonian left's light troops and filling the gaps with chaos. The maniples, nimble and coordinated, struck where the sarissas could not reach. Spear and sword clashed in a brutal close-quarters dance, but the Macedonians could not recover. Panic spread. Unprotected and vulnerable, Nicanor's wing crumbled under pressure. Some tried to flee, others raised their sarissas in a last futile gesture of defence. The Roman lines pressed relentlessly, rolling forward like a tide that no phalanx could hold back. Every attempt to reform was met with the disciplined thrust of gladi and the thunder of the elephant's charge. In less than an hour, what should have been a battle of equals had become a one-sided rout on the Macedonian left. Flamininus' careful orchestration of maneuver, flexibility, and terrain exploitation had turned disorder into decisive advantage. The collapse of Nicanor's forces foreshadowed the doom that would soon engulf the Phalanx's right wing as well. Amid the chaos of Nicanor's collapse, a single Roman tribune saw what no Macedonian commander could: opportunity. Without orders, he detached 20 maniples, roughly 2,400 men, from the victorious right wing. They wheeled across the ridge with purpose, silent in movement but deadly in intent. The Macedonian right, still pushing the Roman left, was unaware of the approaching threat. The Phalanx, rigid and unyielding, could only advance forward. Its sarissas, formidable from the front, were useless against an attack from the side or rear. The tribune's manipoles struck with precision, hammering into the flank and sowing panic among the ranks. Confusion spread like wildfire. Soldiers tried to pivot to bring their long pikes to bear on this new threat, but the sheer weight of the formation made rapid maneuver impossible. Legionaries trained for close combat closed the distance, thrusting their gladi into exposed sides. The phalangites, trapped and overextended, could not recover. Philip himself watched in disbelief as his army's cohesion unravelled. His right wing, once a bastion of success, was now threatened from an angle it could not defend. The tribune's gambit had turned a balanced fight into a domino of collapse. The Manipular legion had demonstrated its ultimate strength: independent initiative, flexibility, and the ability to exploit every vulnerability. In this single, decisive maneuver, the fate of the Macedonian phalanx was sealed. The battlefield that had begun as a close contest was now slipping irreversibly into Roman hands. The Macedonian phalanx, once an unstoppable tide of pikes, now faced an enemy it could neither see nor outmaneuver. The 20 manipoles struck with surgical precision, hammering the exposed flanks and rear of Philip's right wing. The dense ranks, trained to push forward as one, became a tangled, immobile mass. Close-quarters combat erupted. The sarissas, effective only from the front, became unwieldy as legionaries pressed in from every angle. The gladius found its mark again and again, cutting through weak armour and flesh. Shield met shield, screams echoed across the hills, and the disciplined formation of Philip's soldiers began to fracture. Panic spread. Soldiers turned, stumbled, and fell, their long pikes useless against attacks from behind. The once proud Macedonian right, now isolated and outflanked, began to crumble. Commanders shouted, but orders could not penetrate the chaos. Philip V, witnessing the collapse, made a fateful choice. Recognizing the battle was lost, he abandoned the field, fleeing the very men he had led into glory. Without leadership and with flanks shattered, the phalanx dissolved entirely. What had been a formidable war machine was now a routed mass, cut down mercilessly by the flexible and relentless Roman manipoles. The hills of Cynoscephalae bore witness to the death of the phalanx. In its place, the legion system, adaptable, resilient, and empowered by individual initiative, stood victorious. The battle that began in fog, confusion, and uncertainty had found its decisive conclusion. The Macedonian phalanx, once a disciplined wall of spikes, now teetered on the edge of annihilation. The hills of Cynoscephalae echoed with the clatter of broken sarissas and the cries of men caught between hope and despair. On the right, Philip's soldiers, still reeling from the tribune's decisive flanking maneuver, tried to rally, but the ground itself betrayed them. Every uneven slope, every hidden gully turned their pike-heavy formation into a trap. In desperation, the surviving phalangites raised their sarissas, not as weapons, but as a signal of surrender. From a distance, the gesture might have seemed clear, yet the Romans either did not recognize it or chose not to pause. The manipoles, trained to exploit opportunity without hesitation, closed in like predators on the disoriented remnants of what had been a near-legendary army. Chaos spread faster than any command could travel. Macedonian officers shouted orders, but the noise, the heat, the smell of dust and blood drowned them out. Men stumbled over fallen comrades, their long pikes tangling and toppling them. Shields shattered under the relentless pressure of the Roman push. On the left, the rout was complete. On the right, the desperate few were being corralled into inescapable pockets, their cohesion destroyed. Even Philip, who had fled earlier, could do nothing. The army he had meticulously trained and commanded was now a scattered mob, and every Roman advance reinforced the certainty of total defeat. The tribune's maneuver had not only broken the phalanx but shattered its very doctrine. A formation designed for frontal assault could not adapt to attacks from multiple directions, and every Macedonian tactic now counted for nothing. Within hours, the hills of Cynoscephalae had been transformed. The battlefield was a testament to the collapse of a once mighty system. Piles of sarissas, shields left behind in panic, and thousands of Macedonians either dead, wounded or captured. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers, organised, disciplined and relentless, maintained formation, moving with surgical efficiency, converting chaos into conquest. This was more than victory, it was a statement. The age of the phalanx, dominant for over a century, had ended. Rome's Manipular legion, adaptable and decisive, had proven its supremacy on the broken terrain of Thessaly. Cynoscephalae was no longer merely a location, it was a turning point in history, and as the dust settled, the stage was set for Rome to not only claim victory on the field, but to reshape the political map of Greece itself. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the hills that had swallowed Macedonian pride and casting long shadows over a world that had just witnessed the lethal efficiency of Roman military philosophy. The outcome was clear, but the consequences, the fate of Philip, Macedon and the Greek states, would ripple far beyond the battlefield. The hills of Cynoscephalae were littered with the remnants of a shattered phalanx, but the story of victory was not written in bodies alone. It was carved into the very tactics that made Rome's legion superior. Where Macedonian soldiers had relied on rigid, immovable formations, Roman manipules had thrived on adaptability, initiative, and the chaos of broken ground. From the first clash in the fog, the advantages of the legion were clear. The uneven slopes which had doomed Nicanor's left wing became a playground for Roman maneuverability. Unlike the Macedonian phalanx, a formation that could only push forward in lockstep, the legion's checkerboard structure allowed men to advance, retreat and reform without losing cohesion. When terrain disrupted the enemy, the Romans pressed that advantage relentlessly. But flexibility alone was not enough. Initiative, empowered by the legion's system, was the decisive factor. The unknown tribune, acting without direct orders, exemplified this principle. By detaching 20 manipules and striking the flank of Philip's right wing, he turned a still successful portion of the phalanx into a death trap. The Macedonians could not adapt. Their sarissas, deadly from the front, were useless against an assault from the rear. Every attack, every thrust of the gladius, exploited the vulnerabilities inherent in the phalanx's design. Rome's triumph at Cynoscephalae was a collision of philosophies. The Macedonian army had been a hammer, powerful, linear, and dependent on perfect conditions. The Roman legion was a living machine, flexible, self-correcting, and capable of exploiting disorder. The battle demonstrated that military supremacy did not belong to the strongest formation alone, but to the system that could survive, adapt, and act decisively in the face of uncertainty. Terrain magnified the lesson. On level ground, the phalanx might have pressed its advantage. On the rolling hills of Cynoscephalae, it became a liability. Every slope, every ridge, every sunken path gave the legion a chance to flank, encircle, and dismantle the Macedonian formation piece by piece. The battle was won as much by the land itself as by the men who fought upon it. When historians later tallied the casualties, thousands of Macedonians killed or captured versus mere hundreds of Romans, it was a stark numerical confirmation of a more profound truth. The Roman legion did not merely win, it exposed the systemic failure of a once dominant army. The phalanx had relied on cohesion, perfection, and frontality. The legion relied on adaptability, initiative, and disciplined chaos. In every metric, in every tactical moment, the Roman system proved superior. Cynoscephalae was not just a battlefield victory, it was the moment the Roman legion supplanted the Greek phalanx as the dominant model of warfare. From that day forward, armies everywhere would study, imitate, and fear the Manipular system that had triumphed on the rugged hills of Thessaly. And yet, While the battlefield had been decisively won, the consequences, political, strategic, and cultural, were only just beginning to unfold. When the dust settled on the slopes of Cynoscephalae, the once mighty Macedonian phalanx lay in ruins, a testament to the limits of rigid power and the price of overconfidence. Philip V, the king who had dared to challenge Rome's rising dominance, had fled the field, leaving his army fractured, his pride shattered, and his ambitions curtailed. Macedon's fleet was surrendered, its territorial claims stripped away, and its army reduced to a skeleton force of 5,000 men. The indemnity of 1,000 talents struck at the very foundation of Macedon's wealth and capacity for war. Yet the significance of Cynoscephalae extended far beyond the battlefield. In 196 BC, at the Isthmian Games, Titus Quinctius Flamininus transformed military victory into political genius. Standing before the Greek states, he declared their freedom from Macedonian rule. It was a gesture at once symbolic and strategic. Rome did not occupy, it liberated. The Greeks, long accustomed to foreign domination, now found themselves in the shadow of a new hegemon. The Republic had replaced conquest with clientage, creating a network of allegiance built on gratitude, fear, and pragmatic diplomacy. Militarily, the verdict was unmistakable. The Roman Manipular legion had definitively outclassed the Macedonian phalanx. Terrain, flexibility, and initiative had turned what might have been an even battle into a textbook demonstration of systemic superiority. The Phalanx, once the terror of Mediterranean battlefields, could not endure rugged hills, agile units, and empowered officers. Its supremacy was over. The legion had proven adaptable, resilient, and lethal under conditions the phalanx could never master. The battlefield of Cynoscephalae had long since cooled, but the echoes of Roman triumph continued to ripple across the Greek world. Philip's ambitions were curtailed, yet Rome's victory reshaped the entire eastern Mediterranean. Through Flamininus's masterful diplomacy, Greece was declared free, though Greek autonomy now depended entirely on Rome's judgment. City-states once under Macedonian influence turned to the Republic for protection, recognition, and political legitimacy. Rome had emerged not merely as a conqueror, but as the arbiter of an entire region. Every Greek general and aspiring king understood that Roman legions were no longer an abstract threat. They were a tactical and strategic certainty. The age of Macedonian supremacy was over, the era of the Roman legion had begun, and yet Rome's ascendancy was not absolute. Maintaining influence over a fractious collection of Greek states required vigilance, diplomacy, and occasional intervention. Cynoscephalae was the spark, but it was Rome's ability to consolidate power through alliances, treaties, and political theatre that ensured enduring dominance. By 196 BC, Greece had become a Roman stage. Macedon was humbled, the Aegean controlled, and the Republic's hegemony cemented without the heavy cost of direct occupation. The Manipular legion had won the fight. Flamininus had won the peace. Cynoscephalae had ignited a new order, one defined by Roman discipline, military philosophy, and political dominance, shaping the destiny of the eastern Mediterranean and signalling the inexorable rise of Rome as the preeminent power of the ancient world.